Join spiritual feminist and empowerment coach Joni Advent Maher for Trust Your Sacred Feminine Flow. Listen in for intimate conversations about money, transformation, and feminine sovereignty. And now, your host, Joni Advent Maher.
Welcome to Trust Your Sacred Feminine Flow. I'm your host, Joni Advent Maher, spiritual midwife and transformational coach. Today, I'm so excited to welcome back Dr. Semerit Strachan to the podcast. Welcome, Semerit.
Thank you, Joni. It's an honor and delicious to be back.
Yes, and you are joining us from
the Bahamas.
Oh.
It's a hardship, isn't it, to be here in the wintertime? And again, so humbled and grateful to be here. Not something that I do, island hopping in the winter. It's not quite in in my lifestyle yet, but the opportunity to be here was almost a miracle, and I'm happy to be here and to be joining you from this place. Yes.
Well, we can hear more about that a little bit later. But let me tell our listeners about Semerit. So Semerit is an accomplished medical doctor, cultural elder, feminine power transformational coach, and certified intentional creativity coach. She has dedicated her life to helping women break out of the inner fears that limit them from blossoming into the fullness of their contributions in their chosen career. Her signature program, Liberation of the Mother's Daughter, guides women in the exploration of intergenerational transmission of these limitations. Yes, so that is exactly what I want to talk about today, is those intergenerational limitations and this idea of the mother's daughter.
Wonderful. And Joni, before in order for me to talk about this, we're going to jump right in. But I wanted to do this correction right as we started because it's such a common mishearing of what I do. When you were introducing me, you said liberation of the mother's daughter. And will be yes, it's something that happens so often. And as you know, it's liberation from the mother's daughter.
Yes, I'm just seeing that now.
Yes. And so it's just very powerful to me how I'm not exactly sure what to say about it, but I think it'll come out in the conversation. Often, let me let it be at that it's important to restate liberation from the mother's daughter, and we're going to see why as we talk.
Yes, I get the difference already, but tell us a little bit more about what that means, the mother's daughter, and then we can get into why the from is so important.
Yes. So the mother's daughter is, I am going to use this psychologically, spiritually, technological term. It's an archetype. And I apologize about the term, but it just is the best term that allows me to convey a complex concept. And the concept is this: we, as we are growing up, develop complex attitudes, beliefs, and sets of actions and reactions. We are neurologically programmed to do that. A baby needs to assure that his or her mother smiles at them, gazes at them, touches them. And so in infancy, the need for that is truly a life and death need. And so the things that we do and that result in the mother frowning or the mother turning away are things that become not allowed. But the not allowing is something that our neurological system decides from within ourselves. It's not necessarily that the mother says this is not allowed. It's our own survival that says, oh, these things caused her to smile. I'm going to do more of that. Or these things caused her to frown, so I'm not going to do that. But of course, the smile and the frown may have come from a myriad other reasons. And the baby with a developing neurological system, an immature neurological system, ascribes reasons and causality where perhaps it's not needed. It's not accurate. Am I making sense, honey? I feel a little labored in my explanation.
Yes. So you are making sense. So what I am hearing you say is this is a lot about from the professional lingo we call attachment, attachment theory, or our relational bond. And we do have a relational nervous system. That is a real part of our body. And in order for us to develop optimally, we do need that secure bonding and connection. And as little beings, we do whatever it takes to ensure our
Yes.
survival. Yeah, so that's what I'm hearing you say. So it's just that early imprinting that is under our conscious awareness is what I'm hearing you describe. And there are the things that are overt, but you're also naming the more subtle, just the more subtle, kind of unobvious, for lack of a better word.
Yes, I'm naming that the source is unobvious, subtle, under the surface, under the consciousness. But of course, we then begin to grow and develop, and that source takes on a life of its own. And as we grow, the permissions and the forbiddens become more and more rigid. And that's what I'm calling the mother's daughter archetype. In other words, so we get into adulthood, and there are things that we would never think of allowing ourselves to do. And there are things that we are compelled to do. I call that set of permissions and forbidden territory, that set is our perception of what we think would please our mother. And so that's why I call it the mother's daughter archetype. It's a construct that actually has grown inside of our own neurological and system and psyche. And it's been created and maintained by us. I don't mean by us in a vacuum. Of course, it's by us in interaction with and in response to our lives. But one of the main points that I want to get across is that it lives inside of us. It's created, maintained, cultivated inside of us.
Yes, so maybe if you could think of an example, either from your experience or your work with women, the
Yes,
women that you work with, that might be helpful just to give our listeners an idea of what this might
absolutely.
look like.
So I'll give examples of some responses that to some of the exercises that we do in order to, because it's so deep and subtle um, that we have to approach it in a different way. But one of the women that I was working with, um, who was aware that her relationship with her mother might have impacted her capacity to be in relationships, intimate relationships or relationship with men. So she was aware of that. You know how sometimes we know, oh, my mother's, the way my mother interacted with me, or the way my mother did, for example, relationships, I'm is a point of friction between my mother and me, and so that's the area that is tangled up in that mother-daughter relationship. So this woman knew about that, but in the course of working through the program, she came across, she said, oh my God, that's why I don't entertain. And I said, what do you mean? She says, I just realized that at a very early age, I looked up to my mother, who always had her house kind of spick and span, very warm, very welcoming, but everything was just so. And her mother loved to entertain, and people loved to come to her mother's parties or gatherings. And so, as an adult, this woman says, I never entertain. And it's not that I don't like it, it's just that I can never live up to my mother's standards for entertaining. And she says, moreover, I keep my house just a little messy because then I say to myself, the house is too messy, I can't entertain. So that's a powerful multi-layered way in which she was living. I often call liberation from the mother's daughter with a subtext of stop living somebody else's life. And so this woman was living the mother's daughter life, at least in with respect to entertaining and with respect to her connections with her friends. You know, the mother's daughter was the one who needed to entertain in the same way that her mother entertained. And the mother's daughter was the one who could not give herself permission to be relaxed about entertaining. The mother's daughter was so caught in the perfection of the way one ought to entertain that she couldn't give herself the room and the spaciousness to feed her need for connection. Does that make sense? So the need for connection got sacrificed to living up to her mother's. Again, let me just say, it's not really her mother's standards, is her perception of her mother's standards. So this woman's need for connection got sacrificed to her perceived view of her mother's standards for entertaining.
Yeah, so you are unearthing something that is so powerful because it's under the radar. It's not the overt. It's the more subtle belief system that is guiding us, or story that's guiding us, that we often are completely unconscious of. So
Yes.
it sounds like it's a very potent I don't know, thing that you have discovered, construct that you have discovered. And that's why I really wanted you to come on and speak about it, because how many of us, we may have certain beliefs or stories or relationship dynamics with our mothers that we know overtly, but then there's this whole other territory that you're speaking to. So
Yes. Yeah.
so can you talk with us about this idea of the liberation from, like, how do we liberate ourselves from this archetype or this
It's
construct?
yeah, yeah. Um, I well, I can start by relating to you, as you know, the story, my story of how liberation came to me, came through what I call the initiation of my mother's death. And let me stress that you don't need to wait for, excuse me, your mother's death or anybody else's death in order to do this work. However, um, there are very few remaining natural initiations, excuse me again. Um, and death is one. Death happens to be, I believe, in our modern day, the only thing that everything stops for. I had where I can have, yes, where I can have problems at work saying I need a vacation, or I need, imagine, I need a few retreat days. I need to go replenish my soul. Those are totally not acceptable, right? Um, right. However, if I say my mother just died, I need to take a week. It's like, yes, it still is an event where life, the busyness of our everyday life, is allowed to stop. So for me, so I pay a lot of attention to it, but the reason I pay a lot of attention to it is because of what happened to me when my mother died, which were several signs along the way that kept calling me to the liberation potential of that event. I think that especially in our circles, Joni, people kind of are very familiar with the idea that for the person who is dying, death is a liberation, because our spiritual selves have been limited by our human consciousness. It's a beautiful partnership, but it still holds us, and that at the moment of death, the body, having done her work, you know, stops that consciousness, but the spiritual is now able to fly free. So I think that's fairly familiar. And so the person, ooh, I'm about to sneeze again. Sorry. Oh my.
Bless you.
Thank you. We talked about the beauty of being in a different climate, and these are the drawbacks.
So you're
So
speaking about death and
yes,
how for the person who's dying, it's a freeing up.
what? And so that's fairly familiar. That was kind of the attitude that I also had. And then when my mother was dying, my first experience was with a blue heron who announced to me in my spiritual life. So it's more, there was an actual heron um, in the physical world, but I'm talking much more about in my imagination, in my imaginative side. I experienced the heron as delivering the message: this is a liberation for you, Semerit. Not just for your mother, but more importantly, for you. And this interaction with the heron and the fact that there was an actual material heron who was just taking flight at the same moment really imprinted my spirit and my heart, but I didn't really know what it meant. And um, some time passed, and the next imaginative experience from my inner world is being in contact with what I perceive to be the voice of a young maiden. And she said to me, Semerit, there is one life I came here to live. And in essence, I'm not living it. She said, free me to live the life I came here to live. Another powerful imprint, which made sense of the heron's message. Oh, that's the liberation to live my one life. And still was confused as to how do I go about that? Or what does it really mean? And the third experience is being at my mother's funeral mass and the organist playing the Ave Maria, which was a hymn that was so beloved to my mother. She sang it with gusto. And in that funeral mass, it was as if the hymn was emerging from my belly. And I found myself totally sobbing out of control, very loud, wailing, kind of slumped over. And I call it that, my effluvia, my body fluids were pouring from the nose, from the eyes. I mean, from somebody on the outside, I looked a mess. And a lot of people started to hover around me. And in that moment, though, Joan, I was not sad. I was not falling apart. My embodied experience in that moment was of glorious, unadulterated freedom. And I was literally flying high. And let me explain. Most of my adult life, probably a good deal of my childhood life, I worried about what people would think. I worried about appearances. I worried about what should I do or shouldn't do. But in that moment where my conscious will had been overridden by a beautiful hymn and the fact that my mother was no longer here, but this was a hymn that brought her to total life for me, I didn't care. I did not care. It's not that I cared and then pushed it aside. It was not a rebellious, I don't care what you all think. It was from the core of my being a celebration of this is who I am in this moment. And I'm being all that I can be in this moment. And there's no room for me to worry about appearances. It's not even relevant because the energy, the vibration of being all of who I am took over. And that moment is what taught me liberation. I began to think, Joni, what if we were able to access that and we lived our life that way all the time? Like, what could be possible? So that's really, it became a call that I had to say yes to. How will we go about teaching this and facilitating this? Because I believe that's what we came here to do and be, to live that kind of a life.
Yes.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. That is it.
Thank you.
That is what we came here to do and to be. Yes. And
And
go ahead.
go ahead. No, I was going to say I'm grateful for you to have called me onto this broadcast because I'm bridging the material world and my deep inner world, and to have you reflect that you agree, that you can feel into my experience is very affirming. We are bridging two different realities, and on the one hand, I believe that's exactly what the feminine wants us to do. That's exactly what the planet needs at this time. And on the other hand, I think it's sometimes difficult to convey. So I'm very affirmed that you called me. And for the feminine, it's conveyed through these conversations, right? It's conveyed through another woman with whom I can totally be myself, the fullness of myself, and then the having the the power of it, and power is probably the wrong term. Having the flow, the aliveness, the vibration of it reflected and received by another sister is really powerful, and it affirms it. It gives it more reality.
Yes. Yes, it's like a confirmation of sorts. And this touches into the piece that I am so deeply passionate about, which is the potency and the validity and the power of our inner experience, of those unseen realms that we live in, that we
Yes.
inhabit, that we can access, that are so foundational to who we are and what we're here to live in our lives.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
most of the time in the culture we're not talking about.
Yes. Yes. And in fact, we can bridge it back to what we're talking about in our early childhoods or even later childhoods. When we would talk about that, what was the response? There, dear, that's cute. Or, you know, we no longer talk about that. That's,
Yeah.
and so you can see how the mother's daughter begins to relegate the unseen realm as something. We don't talk about that anymore, dear. And so the unseen realm, which, as you know, Joni, I know that you teach this as well as live this. The unseen realm is what gives us our potency. It's what gives us, it's what deeply nourishes us. It's what gives us our strength. And um, at some point, we began to, in order to please the mother, we began to separate ourselves from that invisible realm.
Right, to divorce ourselves from it.
Yes, yes.
And I
And
go ahead.
well, and that's, I feel I'm talking too much, so I want to hear you too. And well, and that's how this divorce that you just named, which I loved, um, that's how we live the pleasing life, the life that is according to our perception of what a good daughter to our mother should live, as opposed to living the life we came here to live.
Yes. Yes. And the piece that I wanted to name, and
Yes, please.
first I want to say that it is in this engagement and this conversation, and I believe that as we as women identify what we know in our bones, in our being to be true, and then we find sisters who can hold that and reflect that and have this kind of engagement to bring it forth into the world. It's part of how we birth a new reality, is just by what we're doing right now and how
Wow.
how we bring it forth. So the piece I want to name is that, because I can imagine that some of our listeners may be thinking, well, mother's daughter, I have issues with, with my father, or that's not really my problem. And I just want to speak to my understanding, because for 99.9% of us, our first primary relationship is with our mother, as infants and even prenatal, that is why this is so key, because we may have other issues, whether it's, with being our father's daughter, or with being, who knows what, how life has impacted us. But because the mother matrix is the first one that we encounter, this is why it is so potent and so important to have some insight or awareness into the way that archetype is operating in our lives.
Absolutely, Joni. You're absolutely right. I believe that the imprint between mothers and daughters, first of all, is life and death. And secondly, because we are women, it's also impacts and imprints on who we're going to be. This is the person who transmits the body, the set of emotions, the set of a way of thinking about how we're going to be, because we're growing up to also be a woman. So yes, and it again, in psychological circles, it is taught that the father's impact is much more. It's one step removed from the basic life and death, and the father imparts a lot of how to be in the world. Right. And so you will have issues as the father's daughter. I mean, Marion Woodman wrote a lot about the impact of the perfectionism and the father's daughter. So I don't want to minimize that. But it tends to be more about our relationship to the world, and the mother being more our relationship to life itself, as well as our relationship to our identity.
Yes.
Now, so there is a distinction, I think, and I also want to say to our listeners, if what's uppermost for you, if what is activated by this conversation that I'm having with you, Joni, if one of our listeners says, well, what's up for me listening to the two of you is the transmission that came to me as my father's daughter, I would say go for it, because the portals take us where we need to be, where we need to go. And in our understanding of psychology and personal development, because we need to talk about it, we necessarily create categories and distinctions. But inside of someone's lived inner reality, all those streams interconnect. So one person might start going with my father's daughter and heal that and find themselves necessarily then at the next layer, which is my mother's daughter.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it does. We have that innate guidance system that is directing our healing or our growth or our transformation. Yes. And so it does all come in its right timing.
Yes.
So we are nearly out of time, but I I did want to ask you if you had either an inquiry or a practice or a tool or a something that our
Yes.
listeners might take away from today that would support them with this piece.
Yes. I have a spoken practice, which is super quick. Uh, and then I have a written practice, which takes a little bit more time. And the reason I mentioned this, the super quick is a little um, misnomer because it also depends on your ability to be coming from depth. And so it's done best then with a partner. And it's a very simple question. And the question is, and I'm going to ask it of you and ask you to answer me with the first thing that pops. So, Joni, I'd love for you to say the sentence after me and complete it. And the sentence is, if I weren't my mother's daughter, I would.
Wow.
Could you say that before you think?
If I weren't my mother's daughter, I would have valued myself a lot sooner.
Beautiful. But you see how that was a little bit of a thought process, right?
Yeah.
You got stopped by the statement.
Yeah.
And so if two sisters were facing each other and could set up this beat, if I weren't my mother's daughter, I would come to the Bahamas more often. And then
Yes.
the other person goes, and then you go back and forth because it's the speed of it, that allows you to catch something that bypasses the logical sensor.
Yes,
You
yes,
know,
yes. I
yeah.
can see that. That's beautiful.
And so you might go to it, 5 times back and forth or even 10 times back and forth, but you'll know the minute you hit something that was, because
Yes.
I'm saying it for your listeners' benefit, that the timbre of your voice changes, the depth of your voice changes, the speed changes, and then that's the gift of the exercise.
Yes, I get that
Yeah,
completely.
yeah.
Beautiful.
And should I give as well the writing exercise or?
Sure.
So we don't often have a sister with whom we can and it's important to do it face to face, so you're really watching each other's eyes, and there's a whole kind of thing to making it work. But if you're by yourself, there's never fear. Although you should join Joni's local circles and find a local women's circle. It's really, it will save your life. But also our solitude, we're never really alone in our solitude. And so I want to give a writing exercise because you don't have to wait until you're in circle to do this work. And I hope all of your listeners know about free write, which is such a beautiful practice where you set your timer, and in this case for 1 minute, I'm going to say the sentence, and you allow the pen to write nonstop until the timer stops. So the timer is really an embrace. It is your container, and your pen is going to keep moving. And if you don't know what to write, you shouldn't know what to write because your pen should be moving faster than your thinking. But if it starts to slow down, you can write things like, I don't know what to write next. This is really silly. I can't really think about anything until, it picks up again. And free write is a gorgeous, gorgeous gift from our inner reality that allows us to be in touch with the love, the caring, and the absolute richness of that world.
Yes.
So thank you. That's a plug for free write. And that's the exercise then. I'm going to give you two sentences. And it's important to do one at a time with the 1 minute, breathe, and then do the other one. And these are the sentences. The first sentence is, If I were not so busy rebelling against what my mother said or did, I would.
Wow.
Yes. And you just let your pen flow on the power of what you just experienced, right? I could feel it in your side,
Mm-hmm.
And this is a bit artificial because I'm moving on, but were you and I in session together in a circle, we would just go for it because the response was so spontaneous. And we would put the pen in your hand because the pen would have wanted to say something. And then after the minute, I would ask you to consider this next one again in the same way. If I weren't so dedicated to pleasing or imitating my mom, I would. And they draw on two such deep streams that are really alive in us, you know. And the last thing I'll say is the exercise is designed that way because whether you're imitating your mom or you're doing the exact opposite of either what she told you to do or what you saw her doing, whether you're imitating it or rebelling it, the mother's daughter archetype is designing your life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. To some extent. Yes.
Yes. It's the paradigm. It's the
Yes.
paradigm within which you are growing and evolving. And the young maiden who spoke to me in my inner world, and by the way, being 66 years old, I said, well, why is she young? And she's young because she's underdeveloped.
Oh.
The one who came to live the one life is underdeveloped because the mother's daughter is overdeveloped. The mother's daughter's development has crowded her out.
Yes. Right? Yes.
And the authentic, vibrant life one needs to totally come out of the paradigm. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with my perceptions of what my mother would want. It's about finding a totally different paradigm in which I am creating the paradigm of me, right?
Yes. The free expression, just like when you were in the midst of the Ave Maria, just that pure, free expression of your essence and being.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Semerit, for coming to be with us and sharing your wisdom and your insights.
I just realized that's what we started with, right? That's why it is liberation from the mother's daughter, not of. The mother's daughter in most of us is alive and well. And in order for the authentic, vibrant us to thrive, we need to liberate ourselves from the mother's daughter.
Yes, full circle.
Full circle. Thank you.
Yes. So, pardon me, if listeners would like to either be in touch or be acquainted with your work, how can we direct them to reach you or to receive more of you?
To receive more of me, I'm going to direct them to the Facebook page, Joni, Women of Everyday Wild Wisdom. Yay. Because that is where I'm curating this material that is coming through. I really believe that the authentic self is wild, but not wild the way modern society has cast wild in the way that you can go out in nature and feel this is what an unrestrained life is.
Yes.
And it's in every day. You don't have to go jump off a cliff and parasail to have that kind of wildness. It can be in the time that you take to really enjoy your cup of coffee, right? That kind of everyday wild wisdom where you go out on your deck and your heart is melted by the sight of an everyday squirrel and the way the squirrel looks in your eyes. That's what I'm talking about. It everyday wild wisdom. So it's a Facebook page, Women of Everyday Wild Wisdom, and I love to hear from people. So we'll also give them my email address, which is drsemerit@gmail.com. And please do call and let me know that you heard me on Joni's podcast. Tell them the title again of your podcast.
Trust your sacred feminine flow.
Exactly. That you heard me on Trust Your Sacred Feminine Flow, and I will definitely make sure to respond and correspond with you.
Wonderful. So I also want to thank you, dear listener. I know that you have received a gift today with this wisdom, but I'm so glad you've chosen to spend your time with us. And as always, to remind you until we meet again, always trust what your heart knows.
Thanks for listening to Trust Your Sacred Feminine Flow with Joni Advent Maher. If you like what you heard, the best compliment you can give us is to share our podcast with a friend and subscribe, rate, and review our podcast at iTunes.